Австралийн Welcome.
Сайн байцгаана хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр ороо манай де факто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын Жоржтауны Их Сургуулийн нийтийн болон ашигын төлөө бус Манлайллын төв одоо дэд захирал Луиза Боярски оролцож байна.
Луиза Боярски 2005 оноос хойш Жоржтауны Их Сургуульд нийтийн болон төрийн бус байгууллагын удирдлагын төвийн туслах захирлаар ажиллаж байна. Төрийн бус байгууллагын менежментийн чиглэлээр илтгэл тавьж, сургалт зохион байгуулдаг. Мөн филантрофи, нийгмийн өөрчлөлт сэдвээр их сургуулийн оюутнуудад лекц уншдаг. Боярски Жоржтауны Их Сургуульд ажилд орохоос өмнө Вашингтон хотод байрладаг ашигын бус байгууллагад гүйцэтгэх захирлаар ажиллаж байсан. Энэ байгууллага нь Арктикийн бүс нутаг дахь уугуул оршин суугчдыг дэлхийн дулаарлын нөлөөнөөс хамгаалах зорилготой. Тэрбээр Жоржтауны Их Сургуульд олон улсын харилцааны чиглэлээр бакалаврын зэрэг хамгаалсан. Одоогоор харьцуулсан улс төр судлалын чиглэлээр докторийн зэрэг хамгаалахаар суралцж байна.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the show, and please tell us about your mission this time to Mongolia.
I came to Mongolia this time in support of the State Department visit. The purpose of it was to focus on NGO management here in Mongolia, and I've been working with the U.S. Embassy here for the past week, and we've been having a number of different meetings, both with NGOs to work on their capacity building. We did a day-long workshop on Friday with them. And we've also met with journalists to talk about the role of NGOs in a democracy. And tomorrow I will be meeting with one of the government departments who works closely with the NGOs to talk to them about ways that the government can be supporting the NGO sector here.
Who were your audience as NGO?
There were a lot of NGOs just from UB specifically, and the embassy's been working with some of the smaller NGOs that need more capacity building, so less the big, well-known NGOs, but some of the ones that are just starting out.
Why NGO is so important that it is at the level of State Department policy, so that probably you are not only working for Mongolia, but for other countries where democracy is young and still to grow. Why is that important?
The United States sees NGOs and civil society as being an integral part of a growing democracy. There are a number of ways that NGOs specifically play an important role in the building of a democracy in a country. The first is that they often help support the political process, so helping individuals and citizens understand what's happening within the government and helping them engage in the political process, whether it's in voting or in demonstrating or signing petitions, becoming part of and understanding what democracy means. The other thing that NGOs do is they help represent marginalized communities that often don't have a voice or easily have a voice within a country. And I've seen a lot of that here in Mongolia, that NGOs are doing a very good job trying to find populations that need a voice and need specific support, and they're trying to find ways to provide that for them.
In that their mission, how do you find NGOs in Mongolia doing that?
So there are a lot of different areas that they're working in. Even in the workshop that we ran on Friday, I met NGOs that were working on disability issues, which are very important, and a specific population. They're working with them to provide support, but also to think about legislation that could be passed in support of that population specifically. There were a lot of people working on education issues for different populations, a lot of young children. They're also working in the arts and culture, which is an important part of Mongolia, which I've been learning about since I've been here.
So we are getting people otherwise not involved, getting them involved in the process of making decisions on the issues important to their life.
This is starting to become something that the NGOs are doing. I think originally NGOs in Mongolia focused a lot on providing services specifically for different groups of people, and are starting to think about how do you engage them in a decision-making process and engage them politically. I think right now the atmosphere in the government in Mongolia is making it somewhat difficult for the NGOs to feel like they can speak out necessarily. So I think it's going to be a evolving process.
Wow. What kind of things they're doing that they are just some sort of hindering this process?
I'm not sure specifically, but I did hear from NGOs that they feel not particularly comfortable talking about issues of corruption and other challenges that they're seeing at the government level. But from the United States perspective, an important role of NGOs is acting as a watchdog for the government and for corporations and helping expose corrupt practices. And so this is one area that I think potentially NGOs could continue to evolve in Mongolia.
And we should.
I hope so.
Public governance, good governance, we cannot imagine the true benefit of this economic growth coming to ordinary people without that integral part.
Exactly. And I've also heard that one new program that the government has implemented in the last 2 years is giving money directly to the local government areas to decide how to invest it in development. And this should be an area that NGOs are also engaged in, talking about what is most needed at these local levels, and also monitoring how is this money being spent, and is it being spent in the ways that the citizens would approve of.
You know, from this year, first time in our history, local authority at the level of IMAC, they get to receive the power of implementing the budget projects, and they will do on their own. And I think this monitoring by NGO at the local level are now the most important. Have you talked about that part?
I've talked to some people who've been working at the local level, but it sounds like NGOs are not being very engaged right now in the monitoring process. And I think that's one place that the capacity of the NGOs may need some training to teach them what role can they play and what is the process for them to engage in this monitoring.
How do you, in a developed society like US, get involved with people's monitoring on budget implementation?
So there are a lot of different ways, but we have NGOs that focus specifically on looking at the budgeting process and making sure that the different areas, it's clear where money is going in the United States. So it has to be, I think, a relationship with the NGOs as well as the media to be able to publicize and be transparent about what is happening with this money, so that when citizens have the chance to vote or have other ways of participating in the democratic process, they're informed and able to engage appropriately.
That's on one side. There are several part of population, a certain part of population who is busy with it. There's some of them as a full-time employee, worker, center, and this thousands of them we have now, whole sector of the economy, I would say. And yet they have a problem with financing their activities. How do you consider that in Mongolia?
It's a challenge. Fundraising for NGOs pretty much everywhere is difficult. It's even a challenge in the United States, where you have a growing sector. We have 1.6 million NGOs operating in the US, so we also have a challenge around fundraising. One thing that's different between how the United States works and Mongolia is that we actually have tax breaks for individuals who want to donate to NGOs. And that's an incentive that I think is an important one. It helps the NGOs have a strong base of monetary support. And even during the economic downturn, the individual support that came from just everyday donors didn't change. It didn't go down during the economic crisis. And that was very important for our sector at home. Right now, Mongolia doesn't have specific tax support for NGOs, but I think it's something that at least the NGOs that I've talked to are interested in trying to find a way to speak with the government and find ways that they might be able to do something like that in the future.
That's exactly the weakest point, where in certain ways corporations see their role in solving certain local problems, and they say NGOs who can do better than the corporations do that, and they want to give them money, and it is not tax exempt or somehow. What would be your advice or your you would think that that would be a very appropriate way to create such a legislation, where in the tax, in which part of a tax? Please tell us about that, your thoughts.
There are multiple ways to do it. In the United States, there are different ways that NGOs get tax breaks. So one is they are exempt from income tax. Because the purpose of an NGO is to do public good, the thought is that the profit you make is going back and being reinvested in society. It doesn't go to shareholders. So there's an incentive for NGOs that way. They're not paying income taxes. Another incentive is NGOs are also exempt from sales tax. And that is also helpful just for the basic supplies and other things that they may need for funding to support their work. And the last thing is, I do think some type of benefit for individual donations is really helpful because it engages citizens, really gets them more involved in the NGO sector because they have an incentive to give. And it also helps democracy because it lets the citizens have a voice of where this money is going, where they think that there's important work being done.
You're talking about the NGO who received the money, and they will be tax exempted from income tax or profit, etc. How about those corporations who gives money, donate the money to NGOs, and individuals who donate to NGOs? In which way they are tax exempted?
So individuals who donate to NGOs, they do not have to pay tax on their gifts.
Okay.
And so that is that's substantial. For corporations, it can be the same. However, what we've found is that most corporations who support NGOs tend to do it through another venue. It's less philanthropy. It's often more they're doing it as part of their public relations work, and a lot more they're also doing it as part of their human resources. So there's a lot of in-kind donations that are coming from corporations to support the NGO sector by giving them often talented people to come and do pro bono work in
and also
the NGOs.
their products to
Yes.
support, probably.
So sometimes products and sometimes skill set, individual skills.
Welcome. Well, that's a very interesting, I think, set of information for our NGOs. So they can send their people during a walk office time, or?
So yes, we actually have a number of consulting firms that typically do consulting for businesses, but have donated their staff time for them to go and work in NGOs. And they see this as professional development opportunities for their consulting staff to give them a chance to work with an NGO potentially on a strategic plan or on a fundraising development plan. And some of our big corporations, specifically consulting groups, have donated up to $1 billion dollars worth of hours of their staff to this kind of work. So we're starting to see more innovative ways that NGOs and the corporate sector are working together to solve social problems.
Well, that's wonderful.
I hope it becomes more popular across the world.
You know, I have seen in the U.S. after my graduation, people were applying for jobs, but it was very important part in their CV when they show the particular work or hours they spend for NGOs to improving their community.
Yes.
And I think it's at the level of culture, sort of.
This is something we see a lot. We run a management training program for NGOs at Georgetown University, and we get a lot of international participants from different countries. And the one thing people say is, you know, the culture of giving and of volunteering is just different in the United States. And I think to a certain degree that is true. However, this doesn't mean we shouldn't try to support it in other places and find ways to make it possible for citizens to engage in NGO work, because the more they're able to really come into NGOs and understand how they work, the better chance they will support them in the future.
And yet for, say, foreign and developing countries, NGOs who are working the democracy for better human rights, the pillars that supports democracy, they have also a chance to either have some training, fellowship, or to get some donations from other NGOs, not only in the US, but in other part of the world.
This is true. I think we're seeing more cross-fertilization between different NGO communities across the world now that we're more global. I think it would be great if we had more training programs for NGOs in developing countries, because it's expensive for them to come to the United States to get training. And so it's been wonderful to be here with the State Department and the US Embassy to be able to provide a short amount of training while I was here, but it needs to be something that's sustainable, and that's going to be the challenge, is how do you create organizations here who can act as capacity builders for the NGO sector.
Would be interesting to learn afterwards. I mean, after a certain time, how they are implementing what they have learned, etc. And I think, well, personally, I think it's a very important part of cooperation of two countries when it comes to the people, you see, people to people. And I think in that regard, NGO and your training is, I find, very interesting.
Yes.
What is a high impact NGOs?
So there's been a lot of research in the United States now that NGOs have become so popular. Right now, the NGO sector in the United States employs 10% of our workforce. So it's a very important part of our society. And so there's been research that has been done to say, well, how do you create an effective NGO, especially given the changing times? NGOs really have to constantly be responding to changes in government policies, changes in the economy, changes in the people who need their support. So what we found is a couple of different things. The first is a really strong NGO needs to have a very clear mission and set of goals. So what change do they want to see in society? And these goals need to be measurable, that they can really track the impact that they're having over time. The second thing that's really important for NGOs is that they have strong leaders. They need leaders who have a vision of where this NGO is going and can articulate that vision clearly, so that both their staff gets motivated, but also people outside of their organization get excited about the work that they're trying to do. And another thing that NGOs need is a really strong internal capacity. And I think this is where there's a lot of need in Mongolia, is to build this internal capacity. You need to have clear structure, and it's really good to have paid staff, if possible, to be able to fulfill the type of work that needs to be done. The other thing, as part of this strong internal capacity, is to have sustainable funding. And what we've found in the United States is sustainable funding needs to be diverse. You need to have multiple avenues of funding at any given time, because funding changes and priorities of donors change, and you need to find ways to balance your funding portfolio. And so those are some of the top challenges. And the last one that we've seen to create a high impact NGO is they just need to be constantly thinking and rethinking how they do their business. So because things continue to change, NGOs need to be able to adjust to those changes and be flexible and responsive to the needs of their constituents.
So what do you advise them to be, to follow these principles you have just mentioned? So
a lot of it is, making sure that they have a strategic plan that that they work on. Usually a strategic plan is a 3 to 5 year plan that helps create a roadmap for what the NGO wants to accomplish during that time. And it's something that they need to review every year to make sure that they're still on the right track. What have they been able to accomplish, and what else do they, where else would they like to go? The other thing is really thinking about how to build their fundraising model. And I think this is something that NGOs in Mongolia are going to have to continue to grapple with, because it's not clear where the best funding streams are yet for this country. Things continue to change. Some NGOs were getting corporate support, which is going down right now because of the mining sector changes, and so they would probably like to have more government support, but right now it's not exactly clear how that will work. And so as a result, they're trying to figure out how to fund the work that they want to do. Most NGOs that I met with on Friday don't have a paid staff. So it's very hard to have substantial impact when everybody's working as a volunteer.
Do you think it's visible in this country to how long it will take time to get having a paid staff and the strategy made?
Yeah, it's a long process. So the United States, it took almost half a century to move from organizations that were basically volunteers started by visionary leaders who then started to have paid full-time staff at their organizations. And it developed as funding sources developed and as the culture developed in supporting them. So I think it's going to take time, but from the NGO leaders that I've been meeting, they're very passionate about the work they're doing, and I think they'll be happy to continue this work and push for more professional organizations as they're able to fund them.
You have been working with Arctic indigenous people. Please tell us about that part of your life.
So my previous job before Georgetown was I helped create an NGO that worked in the Arctic, specifically on global warming issues, during the time that a lot of the science was coming out on global warming. And the work we wanted to do was helping the Arctic indigenous people talk about the experience they were having with global warming in order to provide real-life stories about what global warming meant for the people in the Arctic, not just the numbers and the science that was coming out. So we did media trainings with them so that they felt comfortable talking to the media, but also coming to Congress and giving testimony in Washington, D.C. about what they were seeing.
It's mostly Alaska?
Excuse me?
It's mostly Alaska, or?
Our NGO was an observer at the Arctic Council. So we did work with indigenous people in Alaska, but also indigenous people from all of the different Arctic nations.
Nations, including Russians?
Yes.
Not Russians?
Yeah.
So on two sides of Arctic, on the Russia side and the North America side, and still it is a big problem, the Arctic issues.
They're paying attention to them. I would say it's maybe not the top priority of the Russian government and the American government. And I haven't been following it that much recently since I've been at Georgetown.
So you were making sure that the people talk about their problems to everywhere, sharing.
Exactly.
What was the major problems they were complaining about the most?
So the ones that were related to global warming, a lot of the changes were because the climate was warming up, they were having a lot of health problems. They were having changes in
visible health problems.
Yes, and they also were having, there were new invasive species that were coming in, a lot of them different types of bugs that they weren't used to, and insects. And so it was all very, it was very new to be able to talk about, but it was clearly changing their lifestyles.
You have also your bachelor in international relations,
yes.
right? Which was your particular region or country to work with?
So when I studied at Georgetown for international relations, instead of focusing on a particular area, I focused on trans-state actors, which were defined as anybody external of the government that was working at the global level. So I did a lot of research on human rights, environmental movements, and also corruption issues in developing countries.
And now you are doing the PhD on comparative government, right? Comparative government.
Yes.
What is that?
And my focus in comparative government is actually on the role of civil society in democratizing countries. So it really is looking at the sort of larger theoretical level of how NGOs are engaged in the democratic process. And it's very interesting. It's interesting to see how a lot of NGO sectors, especially the new ones in developing countries, really are facing some of the similar issues and trying to find ways to best engage them in supporting the democratic process and dealing with problems of corruption. And one of the areas I've focused some of my research on is the Philippines, which is where my one side of my family is from.
So in the process of this democratic development, the issue of corruption comes always, every time, everywhere.
Yes.
Why is that? I mean, what is the root of that issue?
You know, it's hard to say exactly, but one of the sayings in political science is that power leads to the desire for more power. And so as you're starting to give particular individuals access to the government and access to those resources, depending upon the culture of that country, there are different ways that these resources are used. What we found, I've seen in the Philippines, is that there's a very paternalistic culture in that country, and as a result, they see access to government resources as a way to support their constituents. And this is part of how the process works for them, is you get voted into office and then it's expected that you provide the region that you come from with support. And that can be done in a legal fashion, that can be done in a corrupt fashion, and it really depends sometimes on the politician and how they go about their business.
Have you been living in the Philippines?
I haven't, but I've visited.
Your father is from there.
My father was born and raised in the Philippines.
See, the Philippines issue and democracy always put in certain questions. For example, the Philippines constitution is the first democratic republican constitutions in Asia in 1900.
Yes.
And today it's after 110 years of developing the country, democracy, market economy, still the country, 1/3 is still poor in spite of not a landlocked country like us.
Yes.
It has everything. They have a people, they have an ocean, transportation, they have a democracy, and they have an English language, but still they have a lot of things to do.
Yes.
So why is that?
I can only speculate, but what I would say is there are two issues. The first is the Philippines has never had significant land reform, which means there have been traditionally a certain set of families who've had a lot of power in the country. Obviously, agriculture is not the only place to make money in the economy of the Philippines anymore, but even so, there's still a small number of families who run and control a lot of the wealth in the Philippines. And these families tend to also then become part of the political process because they're the ones who can fund their own campaigns. As a result, there hasn't been the same kind of structural reform in the Philippines to help support and address issues of poverty.
Isn't it not because people were not involved at the early years of democracy when those about 17 or so families controlling everything? By that time, probably they should be maybe set up certain frame for non-monopoly, etc.
You know, that could be it. It's hard to say because the democracy was set up by the United States, and the purpose was to help transition the country into a democracy where they could, operate on their own. But unfortunately, that did result in these families holding control to a certain degree. And they just haven't found the best way to really fully engage the citizens in the process at large. That being said, they have a pretty strong NGO sector, and there are certain areas of the country that are doing very well. And their current president is really focused on addressing issues of poverty.
Yes.
And so I think it's a very interesting time for the Philippines because they do have someone in power who isn't planning to stay. He's planning to finish at the end of this term. And so he has a limited time, but also I think it's made him very focused on the potentials for change. So sometimes it relies on having a very strong leader in power who has a vision of where the country can go. But I think time will tell to see how it goes.
Yeah, nowadays, the Filipinos have a luck with the president who has not now in any way interconnected with the wrongdoing like the previous ones were. Just the Philippines case of democracy, its origin, development, maturity, is also, I think, a very interesting food for thought for Mongolians.
I think so.
So that if we don't develop NGOs strong enough to see that sudden monopoly takes over everything, and probably having said that, I don't mean against the private companies being big. This private company should be big in order to move the economy. But on the other side, not to the level that dozen family controls whole economy. And I think that part would be also a good comparison for Mongolian NGOs to think that's what sometimes we talk about an NGO at the NGO level here.
I think it's actually a very good model because also the Philippines has recently, just like Mongolia, given a lot of money to the local governments to make decisions about how it's used. So it could be an interesting model to see how they're engaging their NGO sector in that process, because from what I understand, NGOs play a very large role in monitoring of these development funds. And so it might be interesting to see what is working well for them, potentially as a way for NGOs here to figure out the best way to engage.
Very good point. Luisa, I think sometimes that this monitoring and evaluation business, or this process of management, based on not input but outcome of every project, that the government spends our money, whether it's our tax money or our borrowed money on our behalf. And if each these projects have this ME element with certain allocation of budget, maybe 2%, and that's run by NGOs for that particular function, I think would be good help and good division of labor.
Yes, well, I think there needs to be checks and balances, which is what a whole democracy is based on. And when the government tries to regulate its own activity, it takes away the chance to have that external critical eye that can say, you know, this is working well, but these things may need to be improved. So I think finding the best way to divide the labor and figure out how to do that.
That's the solution to financing, because in Mongolia we have a state audit committee, for example, state audit. How can state audit themselves? And they're always coming with very late the report of corruption, etc. And usually under the same political party. They never check properly each other. So that's the problem, I think, of today's level of democracy in the country. And I think, Luisa, your visit here and your work with our NGOs would be certainly good help. And I hope we will have another good impulse to developing our NGOs in this country.
Wonderful. Well, I hope to hear good reports out of Mongolia and how your NGO sector is working in the future.
That's our hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.